I'm about to read another chapter of Introduction to Magic from the first volume, but right now I'm waiting for some of the pets in the house to quiet down so that they don't appear in the background of my reading. And while I wait for that, I just wanted to talk about some of the subjects that are on my mind and some of the things that I'm thinking of doing for this channel. Obviously, one big thing that I want to do a lot of here is create audiobooks for my audience of listeners. Not that I have much in the way of an audience right now, but for my hypothetical audience at any rate. A lot of the books that I have on my shelf or shelves rather, are either classics of magical teaching or, for one reason or another, very valuable sources of knowledge. So anything that I can do to transmit those to others, if nothing else, I feel that gets us on something like the same page when it comes to any sort of discussion of the numinous and spiritual realities. Another thing that I would like to do, perhaps, is to provide some of my own commentaries on these various works and chapters, sort of reflect on them, provide some of my own thoughts and feedback, perhaps only something for other people to respond to, mull over for themselves and see how they feel about those ideas. Also, potentially a sort of instruction tool in and of itself. People can see the way that I have come to think about these texts, the ways that I perhaps meditate on them, some of the techniques that I apply every day without really thinking about it. And they can sort of, I suppose the idea is for them to skip along to where I'm already at in my thinking. I suppose if they see that as a valuable approach to thinking, obviously I don't think mine is the only way to reflect on these various subjects, but I suppose there probably also is a difference between the way that someone with a great deal of experience in this subject matter thinks about these topics, and the way that someone who's very new to it and still trying to wrap their head around what magic is might approach these topics as well. One thing that I'm thinking of doing, perhaps, is going through first the Bible and then later perhaps other ancient scriptures and religious texts as well, and doing a sort of verse by verse, comprehensive, I want to say analysis, but it's really more of a spiritual reading. For instance, the Bible is really supposed to be read in the Lectio Divina meditative process. There's, let's say, an ancient Jewish version of that that's been practiced for a very long time, and has been practiced with a couple other texts as well. For instance, it's supposedly a technique that the Ari applied when reading the Zohar and coming up with his analysis of it. Supposedly a great source in his development of spiritual wisdom. And it's also been a great source of development and inspiration for a lot of the Christian mystics as well. So I feel like it might be valuable to sort of go verse by verse, do my own sort of meditation on it using something like the Lectio Divina process, and then reflecting on that to the listener, compiling a playlist of those sorts of readings. I think that might be another useful tool in the sort of education or pedagogical process that's I'm hoping to develop here. I suppose, real quick, while I'm putting together my thoughts on how I want to develop this channel, I should talk a little bit about what necromancy means to me personally, and why I have labeled this channel the way that I have. So some of the people listening to this audio may already know me from the Necromancer's Grave Discord server that I run, more or less. And it's a pretty quiet server, so I can't really say anyone runs it in particular. But let's just take that concept of necromancy and analyze it for just a moment, I suppose. So, in the ancient Greek and later Roman traditions of necromantia, what we see are a few different processes of attempting to communicate with the spirits of the dead. For instance, we see in the Odyssey the way that Odysseus performs the process of katabasis, which is going into the underworld itself in order to commune with the dead. And we also have ancient attestations of places of divination, sort of like the Oracle of Delphi, some other oracles. These were, sort of, I guess you could say, oracles of the underworld, who would go into these underground pits or caverns, or allow other people, visitors, pilgrims, to go into these underground pits and caverns and to receive a sort of, I guess you could say, mystical experience in a state of trance or half waking, half sleeping. They would experience communication with the dead. Of course, we also have processes like we find attested in the biblical Witch of Endor character of the Obe, or sort of a sorcerer necromancer, who would likely have had a skull or some other vessel or corpse remnant, if you will, in order to channel the voice of the dead, by which means they would attempt to prophecy. The thinking being that the dead, the deceased souls of other individuals, the shades of the underworld and such, had a special access. They were no longer bound by the same understanding of time and space that the living were. In their disembodied state, they could view the future quite plainly, without any obstruction. And so it was good to go to them if you wanted to learn about your own fate or fortunes going forward. Of course, in other traditions, I believe ones that mostly developed later in Europe, and then in the Americas, their necromantic divinations, or divinations using other spirits as well, in order to go treasure hunting, essentially. Again, just under the belief that these spirits were not bound to the same sort of limited sight that we are because of our physical embodiment. That in their spiritual state, they're able to see through space, time, matter, etc., in order to locate any sort of object or identify other events. But of course, they must be communed with by special professionals that have special access to spiritual knowledge. These sort of neo-shamans of their day, who are able to hear, perceive, and understand the voices of the dead. We can actually read, I think, a good modern understanding of this in Martin Coleman's Communing with the Spirits. It's a pretty good work on the subject of sort of modern day professional necromancy, establishing something like a business relationship with oracular and then operative spirits who will do things in exchange for offerings. And this is a tradition that goes back quite a ways as well. We see that in ancient Egypt there were sort of parallel processes, if you will. On the one hand, there were offerings given to the dead, usually in the form of food offerings. But for those who could not afford actual food offerings, they would leave behind sort of artistic representations of food. And the priest would utter these words of power that would give life to the image of the food, which then could provide a sort of spiritual sustenance to the spirits of the deceased, and then allow them to potentially act for the benefit of their living relatives, to sort of do things to ensure the spiritual health of the community, help eventually, cause rain to fall on crops and such. And I say parallel tradition because there's also something similar going on with the gods in their ancient religions and customs. They would take these images of deities and again speak these words of power, perform these invocations, call them down into the image, and then provide food offerings to the image to sort of empower the spirits. And this being sort of the origin of the concept of performing sacrifices to the gods, not because the gods like to see blood and death, but the original thinking being that somehow it provided a sort of nourishment, of sustenance to the spirit, who could then act on the behalf of the people of the community, again helping them with crops and pregnancies and anything that they needed help with in their daily lives. Of course, many people will be familiar with the sort of biblical prohibitions on necromancy, and they're not the only people who had certain taboos around the subject, and there's actually good reason behind their thinking when one is able to ponder it a little bit more deeply. I suppose the main argument typically is that one should not rely on the dead or really the dead or any other spirits other than the primary deity. And I think a lot of confusion that generally comes up around the subject of God is it's thought that God is supposed to be something totally and utterly removed from us, who only acts according to his own sort of whims, and when we rely on him for anything, we're simply, hoping that in his mind it seems like a good idea to, help us out in any way. Really, I think it's meant to be more of a, how to put it, a call for self-reliance in a way that I don't think is very obvious to the modern reader. There's a very strong difference between calling upon these sort of external spiritual entities to help you out and do you a favor, versus taking this inward journey to the deepest core of your own being and finding within yourself the ultimate reality, as we often see all these Jewish and Christian mystics doing, going in and exploring the interior castles, going through the seven heavens, or else rising up to the cloud of unknowing, and finding in themselves this ultimate place of oneness with God, with the Most High. Even in more conventional Christian thought, we have this idea of, as described by Paul, that we die to ourselves in baptism, and that we become one with the spiritual body of Christ. And for that very reason, it is only through him that we're able to enter the kingdom of heaven, because he, as he stated to Nicodemus, is the one who came from heaven, and only the one who came from heaven can go back to heaven. That sort of mentality. And again, not that I want to represent these concepts as purely yourself. There needs to be no confusion around saying, you are God versus saying God is within you, that you can reach a state of oneness with God, but that is not your normal state of consciousness. Your level of personal being, of personality, and sort of self-centered. Though saying self-centered makes it sound like a moral issue, and it's not quite a moral issue, although it can devolve into moral issues in the same way that bad posture can devolve into medical issues. It's more like following the Tao in a lot of ways. It's cultivating this right mindset where you can be in this constant state of communion, and you can just trust the universe around you to work itself out without having to feel compelled to perform any special action or to try to set up a beneficial situation for yourself. So we can find that distinction between I suppose you could call it the work of mystics, like the Christian mystics and Jewish mystics and whatnot, versus the sorcerers and magicians and what we typically think of as the character of the necromancer. These people who evoke and invoke various other external entities to themselves and try to bribe them, to try to provide offerings, to empower them to act on our behalf, rather than, I suppose you could say, reaching for sainthood, in a way, reaching for higher mystical union, so that in becoming closer to God, if you will, coming closer to that ultimate personal reality, our true selves, which is also wholly other, that in that we find a power that is within ourselves, but also wholly other than ourselves, totally outside of our personalities, totally outside of what we think of as being ourself. This person with this name and this, background, that is not God. That has no power. It is only this thing that is totally within me, that is the life in me that I can connect to, and that which doesn't have a personal identity per se, but in a way it has a super personal reality. It is the essence and origin. It is the thing from which all personalities derive the life in them. That is, I suppose, the truth, as it were. Right? That is supposed to be the source of power. However, it does beg the question, is there any way that we can interact with these other spiritual entities without it violating this precept that we are to find the power sort of within ourselves, within this truth that we can find at the center of our being? And I suppose for me the answer is ultimately yes, but it takes a different mindset. A mindset not driven by dependence on these external entities to act on our behalf, to do things for us, but rather our endeavor to commune with things that are outside of ourselves and draw them into our own mystical oneness, if that makes sense. Let me think of another way of putting it. So as we sort of attempt or endeavor to enter a deeper state of mystical union, we also develop, I suppose you could say, the ability to know things in a deeper sense. In fact, the next chapter I'm about to read, an Introduction to Magic, on initiatic knowledge has exactly to do with that very concept. It is knowing things by becoming them experientially, right? And in a way, I think that is very much something that we are called on to do. That is, in a sense, what it means to love something, right? Is that you become one with it. You draw it into yourself, and you draw yourself into it. And the borders between self and other begin to break down. And that is the place in which an intimacy can begin to form, right? And inasmuch as we are called upon to love, we are also, in essence, called upon to, on the one hand, find this union with other people and things around us. And on the other hand, if you will, to redeem or justify them, to put it in those sort of ancient biblical terms, right? And I'll give you a sense of what I mean by that. So let's take gluttony, for instance, right? Gluttony is an evil. It causes people to take in more food than they really need, causing themselves to be unhealthy. And more than just the physical unhealth itself, it is the formation of this deep attachment and dependence on this thing which is, again, totally external to oneself. So in essence, it's not wholly different from the same issue that we have with necromancy and magic originally, which is that you come to rely on something external on which you must depend because you in yourself are insufficient, dependent, scared, powerless in the grand scheme of things. That's the view that you've taken, the sort of worldview being adopted in that instance. So it is with, gluttony, right? You have come to this understanding that you cannot find pleasure within yourself, and you haven't reached this place in the deep center of yourself where you can find ultimate pleasure and joy and inner peace, right? So you must seek something like that of a less grand, majestic quality, but it becomes this sort of addiction, right? Sort of a crutch to our ability to experience joy and pleasure. Right? So we become addicts. We become creatures who cannot exist within ourselves without this supplemental device, and it imbalances us and causes us to go off the rails in a way, right? But when it is redeemed, when it is brought back to something like its original state before it was fallen and corrupted, then it is something that nourishes us, a sort of interrelationship between ourselves and the living world, that we find our life by bringing the life of the world into ourselves, by bringing all the nourishment in the world into ourselves. And the more of the world that we can take into ourselves and redeem and bring into its original and perfect state, the more that we can perhaps change the world, right? And that's sort of an irony to be found here, is that when you try to change the world to make it perfect, to make it better, you find that you're often unable to make a positive change in the world, but in fact often just the opposite occurs. You make a negative change in yourself, and you become angry, frustrated by your failed attempts to make changes, or you become dependent on the things that you think aid you in your ultimately futile quest, etc. However, when we give up on trying to change the world, if you will, And instead, when we just try to bring everything into our total oneness with the original and true reality, when there is not so much a change, but really just a tuning into what was always there, right? A tuning into the truth that has been there since the beginning, that has never gone away, but only was covered up by our own illusory perceptions of it. Then it does begin to change. Then we can have a positive impact. So this is the sort of the catch-22, you see, the double bind, is that only when you give up on trying to save the world can you actually begin the process of saving the world, changing the world, if you will, right? So to take it back to the concept of necromancy, right? If we are performing this act, and, again, all respect to the work of Martin Coleman, I believe that he is probably, right on the money when it comes to, the old concepts of necromancy and how to translate that into modern terms, if you will. At the same time, that approach ultimately doesn't work. It creates a sort of dependence on, again, these external spirits of the dead, who ultimately have less power than we could attain to in a total self-reliance anyway, right? The only benefit that people like Martin Coleman and Franz Barden will often attribute to these operative spirits, if you will, the spirits that we magically contract to act on our behalf, is that they can continue to operate, usually still with only the power that we provide them through offerings or through our own, mystical power anyway, but they can continue to do so even when we are unconscious of the activity. But again, that totally defeats the purpose, because we are called upon to be totally conscious, as conscious of as possible, right? Even conscious of things that are happening at great distances away, things that are happening, simultaneously, which, it's hard to do, but ultimately that's just a growing pain. That's part of returning to our original perfected state, if you will, what the Jewish people considered sort of the body of light, or what the Christians consider the transfiguration, the transfigured body, right? So it's, again, just a return, if you will, to what we're supposed to be, right? And that requires an expansion of consciousness into the domain of what was previously totally unconscious. And so here too, even if the concept is only to have the spirits perform, beneficial actions for other people that we can then be unconscious of, then we're still not doing what we're supposed to do, right? We're showing reliance where we shouldn't have reliance. Ultimately, in the end, I suppose there's nothing too wrong with a crutch if you actually need crutches, right? For instance, to perhaps overextend the metaphor, if your leg is broken, you actually need crutches to get around for a little while. There's certainly no shame in using a crutch then, but you still have to recognize that ultimately life is not meant to be lived on crutches. The point of using crutches is to allow yourself to heal so that eventually you don't need crutches anymore. So again, I just don't think that is ultimately a sustainable way of looking at it and interacting with the concept, right? Ultimately, if one is to engage with the concept of necromancy, it has to be a matter of communion, in a way, of understanding and coming to know this reality of the afterlife, the soul, the spirit, of this other reality, this invisible reality beyond the veil, and the people inside of it. Both the empty sort of, quote unquote astral shell, the soul that for many is left behind without an animating spirit to give it true life, as well as the spirit, which is life itself, which without a soul is sort of, how to put it, undifferentiated life itself. These aspects which must come together, and especially within a vessel, within a sort of body, combining the salt, mercury, and sulfur together, in order to recreate the whole, the three-headed dragon, as it were, of alchemy, just to put it in alchemical terms briefly. Which is part of the process of traditional necromancy, right? That's why you have typically a skull, although Martin Coleman replaces it with a bowl, and I think that's probably just fine as well. But, you're trying to provide a physical vessel and call upon the shade, the empty soul, the husk of the person, and then to give it the spiritual nourishment of life, to provide it with that animating force that makes it once more a person, essentially a way of temporarily bringing the person back to life, except instead of trying to use them to do something that you could potentially do yourself, assuming that it's even something you should be doing to begin with, that instead you're doing it in order to connect, to commune with, to understand, to potentially aid. I've seen people go in that direction to some extent. They try to find what are the things that a person regretted not finishing or not doing when they were alive, and try to help them fulfill whatever, lifelong goal, dream, whatever. Try to help them move on in some respect. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad way of looking at things from a moral perspective, right? However, again, I do think it's sort of missing the point, ultimately. It's like, it could be said that's missing the point, but, chewing bubblegum is also missing the point of life. It's like there are a lot of things we do that aren't on task per se, but aren't wrong in and of themselves, as long as, it's taken in moderation with the ultimate goal still in mind, as long as it's not becoming a distraction from the life that we're meant to live, right? The things that we're actually called upon to do at the end of the day. So, communion, again, drawing it into our own oneness of our own mystical states, coming to better understand, sort of the underworld and the afterlife itself, right? The ultimate goal of mystics goes beyond the individual's mystical experience, ultimately, and becomes a super personal mystical journey, right? Like Nachmanides and his concept that, in the end, everyone in the world ought to become a mystic, and when that happens, then the age of the Messiah will come. In other words, the final age, the age after which, all people can, in his view, I suppose it would mostly be all Jewish people, but all people would live in this immortal life with heaven and earth brought together, if you will. A new, totally other, radically different way of life, and that is to be ushered in if and when the world is mystically transformed, if and when the world itself becomes spiritized, right? And then death can be destroyed, which is to say, cast into the fire. And a lot of people think of destroy and cast into the fire. It's all punishment and judgment, and maybe that's how it's supposed to be interpreted. But I'm not necessarily sold on that concept. We see in the Bible the Greek that is used for torment, basanos, really refers to originally to testing the quality of gold, right? It's part of the process of refining metals, if you will, of essentially perfecting them, in a sense, right? And it came to mean torment, or something like torment, originally because of the process of torturing slaves in order to get them to tell the truth. So you can see that sort of metaphorical or euphemistic application of the term, that relationship of getting a slave to tell the truth being similar to using fire to test the quality of a metal to ultimately refine it. That you're getting a slave to you're testing the slave in their truthfulness, and perhaps in some twisted sense euphemistically trying to refine that person. But it's a concept that Paul sort of uses a lot. He talks about some people becoming saved through the fire. He talks about Christians sort of going through fire in the sense of suffering in their lives and coming out stronger for it and more perfected, because ultimately, as he points out, only that which is perfect, pure, if you will, stainless, can enter heaven, right? You could think of that also as being totally spiritized. And of course, a lot of typical Christians, these sort of fundamentalist types, always interpret that as moral purity. And, there is a relationship there, right? It's not totally pulled out of thin air, but I think it's often sort of a backward relationship, right? A lot of people think that they have to try to lead more morally perfect lives, try to better follow all the rules in order to become more holy and perfect and worthy, right? But that's, I think, very much missing the point. And it's very backward in its logic, because that's exactly what the Pharisees were attempting to do. They were, you could accuse them of adding rules, but what they're attempting to do is to try to make sure that they and everyone else in their society strictly follows the rules such that they don't even come close to accidentally violating rules. And we see the same thing in some Christian attitudes where you shouldn't even, I've seen even saints and things like that who are talking about, you shouldn't even be engaging in dancing because that can lead you to a sort of state of sinfulness and pleasure seeking and things like that, right? And then just to give an extreme example, not a typical example, right? But I think really it's supposed to be the other way around. The point of the Torah, the law, right? The sort of like suzerain treaty that the law is supposed to represent is on the one hand to say, this is how God views things. And so, if you would emulate God in order to be sort of a better representative of Him on earth, then you should be this way. Not necessarily that you should follow every rule to the letter the way that it's written down here. And I think that's a big part of the point that Jesus is making when he, for instance, says, he who is without sin cast the first stone, and when he and his disciples are violating Sabbath rules, technically, etc., etc. But, very much the purpose of the law is to provide examples, stories, where people are not following the law, where God is providing more and more instructions, and people are repeatedly not following any of those instructions, repeatedly coming up short. And so that at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses himself turns around and says, look, you are incapable of following the law. I have been with you this entire time. You're too stiff-necked. You're too stubborn. You can't do it. You won't do it. So this is not a series of laws that you must follow, at least as far as I can tell, me looking at it. Really, it's a story about how, in a sense, trying to make up more laws, trying to make more rules about how people are supposed to behave, is ultimately pointless. Because as long as there's, still this hardness of the heart, as long as people are still stubborn and ultimately unwilling to listen and really unable to follow the rules in the first place, then all rules are just empty air. It all, in the end, goes in one ear and out the other. And even if people wanted to follow it, they just don't have it in them. They're just, too driven by all of the wrong motivating factors to be capable of it. Really, what has to happen is a total transformation of the self into something that is capable of not only following the law, but as Paul discusses, in obeying the spirit of the law, right? Because we see in some of the things Jesus talks about, for instance, when he talks about divorce law, and he says, at the time, God said that, divorce is okay because he knew that their hearts were so hard that, they wouldn't be able to, follow anything else. But really, it's not okay. In the beginning, one woman was made for one man, and that's how it's supposed to be, but not everyone can do that. So, do what you can do, right? I think something that we should take from that is this concept that the law is, I don't want to say flexible, it really never changes, but we change around it. We change our relationship to it based on where we're at with our own spiritual development, based on what we are capable of doing. And the other aspect of that too is that circumstances around us change as well, right? So not only do we change in our relative position to the law, but the world around us changes in its relationship to the law, right? There's a way that you should behave in a, perfect and law-abiding society, and that's different from the attitude that you should take when you're in a deeply corrupt and flawed society, right? You're supposed to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And you're supposed to be able to recognize your surroundings and act accordingly, act appropriately, not succumbing to the temptations of the time, but at the same time, not being so stultified, so intentionally ignorant of your surroundings that you don't know how to operate in society, that you don't know how to sort of go with the flow, to change tack, to act with what the Buddhists call skillful means, right? Sort of responding to the situation that's actually in front of you, engaging with people in a way that they can actually understand what is being said, and not continuing to, just shout at them, this is the way you should be, this is the way you should be, when they're not capable of understanding that. When, in fact, you're only going to, put yourself in a totally disadvantageous position. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes the world around you can be so corrupt that, I guess that's sort of like the Noah example, that the only thing to do is to, build the boat and wait out the storm, because it's not going to, you're not going to be able to adapt to that society without being corrupted by it anymore. The only solution is to just get out of there. Sort of run for the hills, don't look back, don't even, go back to grab your stuff, just get out before everything falls apart. But, so that's, there's sort of not really a balancing act per se, it's more that you just have to come to be aware of the spirit of the law, right? You have to be able to follow this subtle force, this subtle impulse that will always guide you to the correct way of operating in every situation, and you have to try to get as close to that perfect way of operating as you can in each circumstance, right? The approach that you take, the acts that you perform in obeisance of the spirit of the law are not going to look the same in every different situation, right? But they're ultimately going to push things in the same direction, back onto the sort of the true path, if you will, the so-called the way, right? It is the way in both Taoism and Christianity. It is the way, sort of what the Mishnahs refer to the Torah itself as. It's not just instructions. It is, the law itself is the way, right? Not just in terms of, these specific instructions being the way we should live, but rather it is a way of being that will put us on the right path. This subtle guiding influence that we can tune into in order to intuit, in order to simply know the way that we should respond in life, the way that we should live our lives. Right? So I hope that clarified something. It might not have clarified anything, I suppose, but hopefully you have, I think, a better view of where this channel stands, where I stand, and that I haven't left you with any misconceived notions of, my views on this channel, right? This isn't some sort of flagrant, rebellious, like, yes, we're going to practice dark magic and curses and, raise the dead and, conjure demons and have them do our bidding or worship Satan or anything like that. At the same time, it's not intended to go like the opposite direction either. It's not intended to be this, holier than thou, beat you over the head with, this is the way you should lead your life because these are the rules and this is my interpretation of the rules, and anyone who doesn't interpret it the same is stupid and therefore, they're going to hell and me and the people who listen to me are going to heaven and da 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 da. It's not that sort of parody of a Christian that unfortunately some Christians and other religious people often become, sort of the Pharisaical approach, right? In mimicry of the same Pharisees who stood there telling Jesus that he was, this terrible sinner because, his disciples were eating on the wrong day of the week. Sort of that extreme attitude which Jesus accused them of straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. In other words, nitpicking all these little details about exactly the way that we're supposed to behave, but in the end, not actually being good people. Right? That's not the goal here either. And again, the goal is also, not strictly speaking, to endeavor to be more moral people. We're not trying to do the right thing, per se. I know that sounds kind of, fucked up the way that I phrased that just now, but rather, it is to grow the correct spiritual fruits, if that makes sense, right? To recognize that we cannot be better people. We can, however, connect with that core of ourselves, the quote-unquote, the life in us, that animating spirit which gives life to humanity. We can be truly human by connecting and communing with that which is in ourselves, that ultimate reality, that truth, that super personal being, which is called God, right? We can sort of follow the example of the archetypical perfect man, the God-man, right? The so-called the imitation of Christ is what we are called upon to do. And again, the imitation of Christ is not just, living exactly in accordance with the rules, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's exactly what he condemned people for doing, not the way that he lived his life. The way that he lived his life was in perfect communion. He lived his life as one with the Father. That is what we need to imitate. That is the attitude, the stance that we need to take. And there are techniques and methods that help us to do this. For instance, Saint Teresa of Avila, wrote this book for her sister nuns, which is called The Way of Perfection, right? And The Way of Perfection does this sort of deep dive into the Lord's Prayer that Jesus provides. It sort of talks about, if you think about it, what does this part of the prayer mean? What does this part of the kingdom of heaven being within us, so on and so forth. So, to sort of like meditate on the meaning of the words as you pray them to yourself. And eventually even to reach this state of contemplation, which, to her, contemplation isn't something that we achieve. We attain to mental prayer when we simply, quote-unquote, mean the things that we say in prayer. In other words, when we meditate upon our own words, when we truly understand what it is we're saying and think about what the ultimate reality is that we're speaking to when we say them. But if we engage in that honestly, sometimes we can be drawn in by this ultimate reality into this state of pure and total communion and, in a sense, almost identification with this ultimate reality, this state of oneness, which is accompanied by a sort of interior silence, but it's a full silence, not an empty silence. It's not an empty void. It's the fullness of life in reality, right? It is comparable to what in Hindu mysticism they call samadhi, right? It's the state of total absorption, right? It's also, it's the cloud of unknowing. It's the seventh interior castle. It's what the Kabbalists would rise to with the Merkabah process when they reached the seventh heaven and, saw the entity sitting on God's throne reflecting his light in a way that we could understand. It's it's the light that occasionally pierces through the cloud of unknowing, which actually reveals something about the true nature of God, who in and of himself is not totally comprehensible to us. It's just beyond our understanding, but that in this state of communion, we can come as close as is humanly possible in this lifetime to understanding it, right? And that's the same depth of mystical union that, for instance, if you read the writings of the students of the Magus of Java, they'll tell you that you need to reach this state of, total inner silence and contemplation in order to be able to do these chi breath exercises that allow them to cultivate this energy that allows the Magus of Java to do all of these incredible things like lighting paper on fire and, running this energy through other people that sort of shocks their bodies in an attempt to heal them and things like that. Also, a similar thing in the Dragon Gate and in the Taoist alchemy of Wan Liping? I can't remember his name all of a sudden, but so again, just in all of these other mystical processes, this state is you could say, the foundation, the bedrock of one's practice that one has to be able to reach in order to be able to reach anything else beyond that. And, in the case of people like St. Teresa of Avila, in order to, begin to reach a level of sainthood, right? That is the state that you need to be in order to start cultivating the fruits of the Spirit. So you need to be engaged with the Spirit, right? Because it's not you who is capable of doing good. It is the goodness within you that is capable of acting through you. And it's not just goodness the way we think of it now, as in performing good actions. It's more like Plato's concept and Plotinus's concept of the good, right? The good in Plato and Plotinus's concept is more like this. It has to do with the world of forms, right? Plato's concept of a sort of abstract metaphysical reality. So, for instance, in the physical reality, there are chairs, but in the metaphysical abstract world of forms, there is the form of the chair. It is sort of the archetype, the spirit of all chairs, the spirit that manifests chairness in everything that we recognize as a chair, right? So, if you will, the good is, he says, it's like the sun, in the way that the sun shines light, allowing us to be able to see every physical thing. But the good shines a sort of intellectual light, if you will, a sort of invisible light that allows us to know anything in order to be able to sort of see it with the mind's eye, if you will, right? So the sun might allow you to be able to see a chair physically, but you can't even begin to think of it as a chair unless the invisible light of the good shines down upon it, allowing you to know it as a chair, right? It's the goodness that manifests itself in every good thing. So that is the good, and that it gets identified with God. God is the good, right? Call none good but God. It's sort of the same concept that Jesus was relating to people, Jewish people who had been influenced by Greek philosophical thinking already by that point in time. 500 years of philosophers like Democritus and Plato, whose ideas spread throughout Greece and eventually began to influence their Mediterranean neighbors, right? Including the people of Jesus' time who eventually wrote, and translated the Gospels and the letters of Paul into Greek for a Greek-speaking audience. Right? So I guess that's everything I had to say about it for now. Although obviously I've set forth a lot of plans that you'll find interesting for future content, and hopefully I've also, just in this discussion in itself, other than saying too many times and potentially stumbling through a lot of my words, that I've at least sowed the seeds of future interest and more commentary and content by yours truly. Well, until next time, this is the Necromancer, signing off.